the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And our special guests for today's episode are Kaylee Martin, historian here at the museum.
Hi, Seth.
Logan Gross, historian.
Hello.
And last but most certainly not least, Tommy Lofton, director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum.
Hey, guys.
Today, we will be discussing the 1969 film Bridge at Remagen. Bridge at Remagen is set in the closing days of World War II on the Western Front and focuses on both sides of the battle for the Ludendorff Bridge. The efforts of the Germans to stop the onrushing American forces are shown as they attempt to use the Rhine River as a natural defense from the flowing tide of enemy troops and equipment. While at the same time, the film shows the experiences and plight of a small platoon of armored infantrymen from the 9th Armored Division as they push through Germany and up to the Rhine in the final violent days of the war. Bridge at Remagen stars George Siegel as Lieutenant Hartman, Robert Vaughn as Major Kruger, Ben Gazzara as Sergeant Angel, E.G. Marshall, Bradford Dillman, and many others. The film was directed by John Gillerman, produced by David L. Wolper, and written by William Roberts and Richard Yates. The film received mixed critical reviews upon release. So as we always do, and Kaylee, I'll start with you, ladies first. In your opinion, how accurate is Bridge at Remagen?
They got it right that there was a bridge, that it was at Remagen, and the Germans were holding it and the Americans took it. I mean, it's not super great to me as far as accuracy goes.
Tommy?
I agree with Kaylee on that one. I think it's, even the bridge itself, I think, was shorter in the film than real life. And it seems like the Germans have about the accuracy of stormtroopers in Star Wars when they're firing weapons. Overall, yeah, there were tanks involved, not necessarily this many M24s, but not the most accurate, but it is somewhat entertaining.
What about you, Logan?
Yeah, I would agree with them. They got the basics of what happened. Americans were trying to grab a bridge over the Rhine. The Germans were trying to hold it. And that's pretty much it.
I think I agree and I disagree to a point with everybody here. I think if you look at some of the tactics that I know we'll get to, I know we're going to talk about that. Those are grossly inaccurate. I mean, I almost said the Shermans, but the tanks rolling, flying down the road, and those things are moving.
They are.
And Chaffies will move, but they don't move that fast.
I mean, they're getting it.
Film footage is actually sped up.
Yeah.
If you watch that beginning sequence, there's two things that I noticed, and I'm weird about this in movies and noticing, someone's button is undone in one scene and it's button the next time. But if you watch the beginning sequence again, the film footage is actually flipped. You can see all the truck drivers have steering wheels on the wrong side, serial numbers are backwards, and all the film footage has been sped up. When it shows the scenes, I'm guessing were shot by a helicopter, when they're kind of coming around a curve, you can see they're doing about 90 miles an hour, and there's no way that tank would do that, and if it did it would roll over. But
the Jeeps, too.
Yeah, I mean, the Jeeps are going faster than I drive on the interstate. Probably.
Yeah, they're moving, and I don't really quite understand that. I mean, I got my theories on that. I think they're trying to show the speed at which the Americans were pushing towards the Rhine. At least that's what I'd like to think. But it's obnoxiously fast how those things are moving, and they're firing on the move. And of course, that was not American armored tactics in World War II. But we'll get all into that all in a minute. But there are some accurate points to the film. I think the whole. Yes, there was a Ludendorff Bridge, and yes, the Americans were trying to take it, and the Germans were trying to hold it. But, there's a lot they leave out of that whole story.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just and in the movie, they make it out to be a very long, protracted thing. And again, we'll get to this too. And in reality, it really wasn't quite that long, although there were portions of it that did take longer than others. But, it's kind of halfway. But one of the things about this movie is that all the names that you see of all the characters and the individuals are fictitious names but they represent real people, mostly represent real people. So the real individuals of whom this film portrays are fairly well documented, but like many World War II movies, the characters are fictionalized with little to no backstory, and that is very true. Why do you think this is, and are there any stereotypes present?
I do wonder about this, if it's a kind of a legal thing. Is it easier to just use, stand-ins? That's probably the case. But it's unfortunate because in this instance, there are some really interesting people with really interesting stories. I mean, Carl Timmerman, who actually leads the unit across the bridge. I mean, really fascinating individual. And with the Germans, too. I mean, what happens to some of them, these real men that get executed and they're just kind of lost to history. But I would have to guess it's easier to have fake characters than portray real people.
I agree with Kaylee. I think, you have to worry about a lawsuit, especially for those individuals that you might be, who are probably still living, that you may be painting. At that time, right.
Yeah.
That you might be painting with a negative brush, if you will, within the film. And I think, Hollywood probably wants to stay away from that. Unless it's a film about an individual like Patton, I think the best thing to do is typically stick with composite characters and other things.
Yeah, so I agree. I think that because they changed the characters so much, they would have definitely run into legal issues. But also the director chose a very specific tone for this movie. It was very different from what you would have seen in World War II movies earlier in that decade.
It's very anti-war.
It's very anti-war. So I think that changing the characters really fit that message that he was trying to send out in his film.
I think there's some interest there, though. I mean, you talk about, the names were fictionalized, but they were, by and large, based off of real people. I think there's one two that really stick out. One is the captain. Is he a captain? The major.
The
major. Yeah. Bradford Dillman's character. That guy is a wang. Straight up. All he is, he's a glory hunter with his commanding officer, the general at that point, and a colonel at another point, and then he turns around and tells his captain, who was killed later, John is the only name he's given, but then later it's George Siegel's character. He acts like they were assigned that mission, when in reality he was saying, we'll do it. We'll do it. And of course, he's never at the front actually doing it. That guy is a horrible, horrible person. He's a horrible leader, unfortunately, of which there are plenty in any military unit. But this guy is he's just a deplorable infantry officer, or armored infantry officer, if you want to be technical. And, I can see where there would have been major legal ramifications had they been basing it off of one actual person and made that person say those things and do those different things, or not do those things, however you want to look at it. But talking about like the anti-war, and again, we'll get to that in a few minutes, but I think there was a message that they were trying to show too, and it wasn't just necessarily anti-war. I think it was something about, it says a lot about the exhaustion of the American army, and those of us who've studied the subject for as long as we all have know that by March of 1945, unless you were fresh off the boat, of which there were plenty, GIs that were fresh off the boat, you are pooped. You are done. You are run down. And the impression that you get with this platoon, this armored infantry platoon, is these guys, most of them, are veterans, and they are done. They are done. I mean, you can just tell by their attitudes. You can tell by their lackadaisical way they wear their uniforms, and the way they conduct themselves. It reminds me, certain scenes in this movie remind me a lot of Fury.
Yeah.
And we can get to that in a second in more detail, but I think the attitudes of that, and I'm going to get to that in this next talking point, are accurate for that time period. And that, there are scenes in this movie that show the American GIs who, we always think of being these, pillars of virtue in Europe in World War II, which is frankly not the case, as we've discussed many times, and not pointing a finger at anybody saying anybody's bad, but I mean, people are people. It shows the American GIs to have a lack of compassion towards a German civilian population in this movie, quite alarmingly so for 1969, really. And the film also portrays the armored unit's entry into Remagen as very destructive, and we'll get to that too in a minute. But what do you guys think about the lack of compassion towards a German population? There's a particular scene in the hotel when Siegel and his boys go in there, and the Gauleiter of the town, I think he's the Gauleiter of the town, he that's where the kids shooting up from the window and all that jazz, shooting at the GIs coming in. What do you guys think of that? What do you think of the depiction of that?
I actually was just watching a documentary yesterday about a lot of filmmakers and Americans moving into Germany. And one of the things that I think applies here, they said, is it was amazing. We got into Germany and we never met a single Nazi. nobody was a Nazi. Nobody did any of this. And I think the Americans quickly got tired of this. I didn't have anything to do with it. Nazis, we don't know Nazis here. They're in the next town down, but none of us are. And I think they were getting fed up with no one taking responsibility for what had been happening. And I can see them being really over it at that point, for sure.
I agree. Tommy, what do you think?
I agree with Kaylee on that. And I think there's some similarities in this film with how they treat that topic. Just like with Hell's for Heroes, another podcast that was done, and I think at this point in Hollywood too, they had a chance to be a little bit more open and honest with things. Like you see one guy who's doing nothing but loot pretty much the whole film. You actually see an individual female in this film and conversation in there that could potentially have happened at the time, and it's probably, as far as movies go of World War II topic, I think there's actually probably stronger language in this, plus, brief nudity compared to other films before it. It's a little more free, and I think that's why they weren't too afraid to show, hey, there's some anti-heroes in this film, too, with some of the officers. And with the German people, I mean, I know with some of the interviews that I've done over the years and veterans I talked to, it was obviously different, too, depending on what your duty was or your job, MOS, whatever. Some guys I remember talking to said when they got into Germany, they just felt anger because they just felt like these people have supported this whole thing. They're the whole reason I'm here, their government and all this. And I think we had some Americans that felt that way, and I can understand that, going into there. And I could see that being somewhat realistic, and especially after here you are in this town, here's this house with white flags outside, and then all of a sudden here's a kid with an MP40 shooting from the top window. Are you surrendering or not? And you're potentially costing my men or my buddies their lives. Yeah, right. And
a couple of them.
Could be more too, So I could see having the anger and going in there and pretty much feeling like you could care less about the individuals who are inside that building.
What do you think, Logan?
Yeah, all of that for sure. But also in this scene, he's kind of roughing up the innkeeper. The innkeeper saying, "Well, that's not me. This is not me." All while having a swastika lapel pin on, and he grabs it and says, "Yeah, maybe you should get rid of this next time." It's ironic.
Oh, and the obvious white spot on the wall where the portrait of Hitler had been hanging 10 minutes prior.
That was well done.
Yeah, I thought I liked that.
Done.
But and talking about the destruction, though, that was Hollywood.
Yeah,
that was
oblivious.
Insane, gratuitous destruction.
Yeah, well, they filmed a lot of this movie in then Czechoslovakia, and when they did it, the town or the area in which they were filming it in was actually slated to be destroyed. So the buildings that you see blowing up are real buildings blowing up. It's not a set. It is not a Hollywood recreation. They are blowing the living heck out of those buildings because they had to be demolished anyway. So it was very fortuitous that the filming took place there. And it does look really, really, really cool. But, going back to the whole topic of lack of compassion for the German population, I agree with what everybody said here, and I remember people saying that specifically, is that, when they got to France, everybody was happy, and by everybody I mean the civilians. They were happy to see us, and then when they went to Holland, they were really happy to see us, and it just, the further they went east from the English Channel, the happier the people seemed to be. And then when they got to Germany, nobody smiled.
Yeah.
And by nobody, I mean the civilian population. More often than not, they were not out there handing out bottles of schnapps when the Shermans and later Pershings came blasting through town. They, if anything, they were holed up inside their houses because they, this is the enemy, meaning us. This is the enemy coming into your town. You don't know what they're going to do. And those people have been told for years that, the Americans and the British are, the devil, and just wait till you see the Soviets if you really think these guys are bad. And, I can understand the Germans' coldness in a way, but I also completely understand the GI's lack of sympathy and compassion, and then it was a real thing. I mean, they were not mostly compassionate or sympathetic towards the Germans' plight at all, because like you said, Tommy, they were the whole damn reason that they were over there in the first place. They interrupted their lives to come over there and stop these people. And the last thing they wanted to do was hand out chocolate bars and make friends. And I think the fact that they show that in this movie is cool. I mean, well, I say cool. That's not a proper term. I think it's good in that it does depict it really the way it really was. And for that, we're talking about the inaccuracy. That is, I think, is an accurate point. And as I said, there's points through this movie that are really accurate, and I think that's one of them. And like you said, Logan, it was a perfect point. I didn't think of that until you said it. They pull the party pin off the dude's lapel, and he's claiming that he wasn't a Nazi. It's like, well, actually, yes, you are, because you had to have a pin like this because you're a member of the party. So yeah, you kind of are. And it's interesting because if a child was killed in France or Belgium by accident by American forces, a lot of times, more often than not, and I'm not going to mention names, but we all know that we've heard stories of that happening from people that we interviewed or you may have listened to, and it was a horrible tragedy. Whereas I'm not saying that they enjoyed having to kill German children, but it was a different thing because they were shooting at them. They were like this kid in the window at the hotel.
You could see Hartman's character.
The angel, the sergeant.
Yeah, doesn't even care.
Yeah.
Took him out, trying to loot him.
Yeah, and it was unfortunately a very real representation of going into the Reich in 1945. But talking about the armored units, very destructive. Yeah, I mean, I getting back to what you were saying, Kaylee, I agree. It wasn't quite like that. Meckenheim is the name of the town. And that's one thing, too. The locations in this movie are accurate. Like the names of the towns that they give, they were really, that's where the 9th Armored was. It's, those are the towns that they launched from to get to Remagen and stuff like that. And no, they didn't come rolling through. that did not happen.
They did miss one movie cliche. They didn't specifically target the corners of buildings. I don't know if you noticed. It's always the corners of buildings in movies seem to be like the target for these things, but there was wholesale just plowing through there, which they really didn't. There was actually very little to no fighting in Remagen at that point.
Right. So in the film, the soldiers are portrayed as I said earlier, tired and relatively apprehensive about assaulting the Ludendorff Bridge. Was this the true morale of the troops at this time? And that's an interesting question I think we can debate here for a minute or two. Tommy, you look like you want to say something.
I think it depends on the unit. I think it depends on where you are, how long you've been on the line, what you've been seeing. In this situation, there's I think several reasons. Well, one, this is a unit who's seeing a lot of action. They're moving very quickly through these towns, and I think that's
in reality.
Right, in real life, here's the 9th Armored moving through and blowing through as much as they could. And then you have officers like the major in the film who's volunteering you for every single assignment possible, it feels like. And I think some of these units who had been fighting for quite some time, whether it's been since Normandy or since the Bulge or whatever, they're done. They've had enough. They're exhausted. They haven't had much of a break. And here, they're having to push this much farther and this much faster. So I do think there is some accuracy to that. And I think, most of the folks I've talked to who were frontline, whether it was armor or infantry or whatever, by this point in the war, they were tired. And they were tired of dealing with the Germans. They were tired of seeing the Germans. And like Kaylee said earlier, everybody they're meeting, the closer they get to Berlin, everybody seems to be, I'm not a Nazi, or I fought or my family member fought on the Eastern Front, even if that isn't always the case. But no, I think that's actually a pretty accurate portrayal for the GIs. Now, I did notice the Germans had pretty clean uniforms in the movie compared to the GIs. There's some things in there we can talk about with that, but...
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think they were tired. They were a lot more cautious about going and assaulting a bridge, for sure. I've just finished reading a book about Normandy, about the Big Red One in particular, and they were not thrilled about having to assault the beaches there. They thought when they got pulled out of Sicily, they had for sure earned their ticket home. And then they found out they had to go to France, and they weren't particularly thrilled about that. So I can imagine, especially coming out of the Bulge, trying to take this bridge was the last thing that they wanted to hear.
I mean, again, I think the movie does a pretty good job at showing that. I mean, these guys, you hear it say it in the movie, and it becomes a joke to them. We're the cutting edge, meaning they're the spearhead. And, while Timmerman, the actual guy who George Siegel's character is based off, was a highly experienced infantry leader, they weren't always the spearhead. But even if they weren't, I mean, these guys were worn out, man. I mean, this is the 9th Armored Division. These guys have been fighting a long friggin' time. They were pooped out. And the fact that, that they weren't excited to take the Ludendorff Bridge, and again, the actual assault across the Ludendorff Bridge was not like it shows in the movie, not even close. But, I think that's a bit of Hollywood there.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
They're showing, I don't want to do it. Well, who the hell does? But I mean, that's your job. But, I mean, in reality, it didn't go down like that. But in the movie, I think that's a little bit of nom.
Absolutely.
Because it's made in 1968.
Absolutely.
It comes out in 69. That's a little bit of Vietnam right there. Like, man, I don't want to do that. The officer's telling me to do that. Well, you kind of have to.
And to that point, Seth, I agree with you too. I think there is some of that in there, and but to also look at other movies, Battleground and even Band of Brothers, some of these other things out there. It's interesting. At some point in a really good war film, typically you're going to see that we're always, E company or B company or whatever's always. When is another company going to get sent up on the front, or when are they going to have to take point? There's always that. Complain, gripe, feeling, whatever, of a lot of the GIs. And I think this is true whether it's infantry, armor, engineer units, whatever. I think everybody kind of feels like they've been the ones out front this time. Let's let somebody else have a turn. And I think that's pretty accurately reflected in most films. And I do think there's an element to this. But I think you're right. With the setting of when this film was made, and I think there's a little bit of that
kind of anti-establishment.
Anti-war, anti-establishment.
Yeah.
There's also the thought that, they think either since the bridge is intact, there's a fear, is it going to be blown while we're on it?
Which is a very legitimate
fear. Or is it going to be blown
Mm-hmm.
once we get across and we have, 30, 40, 100 guys across and we are cut off? So I can definitely see nobody's going to relish that task and that possibility that you could be on that thing when she goes.
Which in the movie, of course, they were.
Yeah, or worse, cut off on the other side, arguably.
But in reality, of course, they were not. The bridge was, just for clarity's sake, was not detonated with American troops trying to cross it. It didn't work like that. It was detonated for sure, but not with Carl Timmerman and his people in mid-span. That's a bit of Hollywood, and like I said, I agree with everybody here. I think that's a little bit of nom too. So the next question here I wanted to ask you guys, and I'm going to take this one just to start. Was the capture of the bridge as easy as it was shown in the film? No, it was easier.
Agreed.
In reality, it was.
Less than an hour or so once they got to the bridge itself.
And they had one casualty, and he was just wounded.
Yeah.
They took sporadic rifle fire, and they took, some incoming artillery that was being thrown. I guess it probably was mortars, but regardless, there was incoming mail coming over the Erpler Lay, landing on or near the bridge, and that's the guy that got hit. I think he got hit by shrapnel. I don't think he got shot.
Yeah, he was just wounded.
But it was much easier. It went fast, and by fast, I mean, they started at one end before they knew it. They were already at the other end of the dang bridge. Yeah, it was not nearly as dramatic as they showed in the movie. But then again, if you showed it in reality, it wouldn't be a very dramatic movie, would it? So.
Well, one account I read actually said that the first guy across the bridge ran across because he was looking for a sergeant. And he thought he had already gone across. So that's one of the kind of legends that came out, that the first man across the bridge, it was an accident. But it was very easy. I mean, it's, like you said, it would have been a really boring movie.
I think I know what you're talking about that guy. I think that guy went across, realized that there was nobody there, turned around, went back, and then went back across again. So he actually made the assault, quote assault, air quotes here, twice. I do not remember his name, but he was part of Timmerman's platoon.
And I wish they would have shown in the film before they ended it too. Some of the other, there was 4 major divisions or something that crossed the bridge before the eventual collapse, if you will.
Yeah, you could make a whole movie, actually. Some of the worst fighting that they experienced in Germany is across that bridge. Yeah. And my grandfather was actually in 47th Infantry Regiment, and that he was in the 2nd Battalion, and they took some incredibly fierce fighting on the 9th, the 8th and the 9th, and that in and of itself would make it an amazing movie.
And I know the 99th Division, which of course earned a little bit of fame, if you will, in the Battle of the Bulge. They were one of the few units to make it across too before the bridge was gone.
Yeah, there were several armored units that got across there too. Not the least of which, obviously, was the 9th Armored Division, or part of them anyway. Speaking of armored, tanks play a major role in this film, and rightfully so, because you're portraying the 9th, wait for it, Armored Division. So, how accurate was their portrayal? And we've kind of talked about this already, but we can keep on trucking here. Let's discuss their role in the end of the film and in the actual event. First of all, they were not, the light tanks that are shown. As we said, they were not flying down the road at 100 miles an hour, shooting and everything. And I know, Tommy, you said it when you and I were talking before, the noise that the report makes drives me crazy.
Yeah, it drives me nuts. So
there's no tank in the world that sounds like
yeah,
that.
no. Throughout the whole film, it seems like every single time that a tank fires, it's like the ricochet sound from a Western movie, and you know. And I get it, they're probably firing blanks and powder. You know, most of the time you don't even see the barrels recoiling or anything, whatever. I can deal with that. But that annoying sound that they use, some of the sound effects in this film, especially the MG42, I'm sorry, it doesn't sound anything like that in real life. You know, I feel like they could have done a little bit better with some of the sound effects in there, and it doesn't even match up. Sometimes you're hearing things blow up or fire or whatever, and the weapon's not even firing yet, or it's through firing. But going back to the tanks, no, I think, you know, obviously they have to play. They're almost their own character within the film. You don't see a lot of the tank commanders. You see the individuals in this platoon, and then you see the tanks. And I think some of the usage of tanks is interesting. I wish they could have used more accurate tanks for this, like Sherman tanks. And, you know, I guess maybe we had given a bunch of Chaffies to the Czechs. I don't really know why they were all pretty much Chaffies. But you know, Shermans and some of the other tanks in there would have been a little bit better to see, but...
Well, they had the Pershings. The Pershings were the ones that they sent down there initially, like the, you know, and then because they were new in theater. When did they get? They got what, February?
Like
February is when they first arrived.
Yeah, so they were new. They of course, this is the tank that was supposed to take the place of the
tank
Sherman.
of all tanks.
Yeah, this is the heavy. This is the United States answer to the King Tiger. And had a 90 millimeter on it, I believe.
Which, by the way, if you want to see one, we have one at the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. That's actually a low serial number and believed to have been part of those first that were sent to the ETO and may or may not have even been involved in some of this and the fighting around Cologne. So,
well, that's cool.
There you go.
Yeah.
But the Pershing was cool, and they were sent down there. I read this the other day. They sent the Pershings down to, and I forget the actual name of the commanding general of the 9th Armored. I do not remember his name. You might be right. Frankly, I don't recall. But either way, he made it a point. He said, you know, don't send, because they still had buku Shermans, but they was like, don't send those, send the Pershings, because the Pershings were huge, and it scared the living bejesus out of the Germans because they hadn't seen these things before. Even the veteran soldiers, German soldiers who would have been there, of which there were a few, you know, they'd been used to seeing the Shermans of the teeth. They'd never seen this behemoth. And they sent them down there specifically to scare the hell out of the enemy, which they did. But then conversely, they were so damn big, they couldn't get across the bridge. They were too wide. They couldn't get across the stinking bridge. So they had to send Shermans down there because they were narrow enough to get across because it was a rail bridge.
It was, and they planked it over so that the Germans had planked it over the rail so they could get their guys back across, and they had like horse-drawn stuff they were pulling back across in those last few days, and so yeah, they had covered it up though.
There is one scene in the movie that I think is cool, and it is accurate to a point. You see, there's a lot of trains in this movie, and again, because it is a rail bridge, and Remagen is, well, I guess it still is, it was a rail town. There was a lot of rail traffic moving through there, and they were all going east back across the Rhine to get deep into the fatherland. Well, they're actually, you know, they show a couple of scenes where the tanks shoot up a train. That is accurate, but the train was on the other side.
Yeah.
It was on the German side of the river. It wasn't on the Remagen side. It was on the Erpler-Lay side, and it did get shot up by tank. I'm assuming it was the Pershings. I guess, I don't know, but they shot the crap out of the thing and stopped it right where it was. So I mean, that's kind of cool. You know? And the movie does a fairly decent job of that.
The interesting part about that, from what I've read, that train had actual troops in it. In the film, again, going back to that anti-war thing, it was full of wounded German soldiers.
Quite a lot of them, too.
I do have to say, one cool thing I thought in the whole film is toward the end of the movie when the tanks are rolling in, and it doesn't matter if it's a car, if it's barbed wire, I mean, stuff that you wouldn't normally put a tank over, they just don't care. And you see them rolling in mass numbers. I still think that's probably one of the coolest scenes of this movie and of a lot of war movies. It's just, there's just something cool about tanks anyway, but when you start seeing them, I don't care what size they are or era or whatever, when they're coming in that number and they're just rolling over everything, it's just cool.
It is cool. There's one scene I think that's actually very well done when it comes to armored fighting inside of a town. So as we said, it was the fighting in Remagen, which, as we all said, didn't happen like it did. But there's a tank that rolls around a corner. It cuts a right corner, and it gets zapped. It gets blasted right there. And then there's another tank behind it who clearly, theoretically, one would think saw what happened to his buddy's tank. He's like, nope, blam, and he moves right through a corner, right through a brick wall, and takes out the position, which would have been accurate tank tactics for fighting in a city. But of course, it didn't happen in Remagen. The film portrays the bridge over the Rhine at Remagen to be a crucial part of ending the war early. Is this accurate? Logan, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I totally think so. I mean, the original plan was for them to mop up the West Bank, Monty to cross in the north, and then the Americans to do some crossing in the south. Once they took that bridge, I mean, it was go time, and they were getting across. What was it? We said like 4 or 5 divisions immediately right across the bridge, and they're shooting forward. You get Patton a couple days later going across, and then Monty, and then by the end of the month, by early April, they have the entire Ruhr pocket enclosed. I mean, it absolutely just changed the game.
I think the psychological value of getting across the Rhine was major. And I think that had a huge impact on the civilian population and the German army, which was already breaking down at this point, arguably. Some of the things I read, I mean, the chaos. And one of the things that the film doesn't do a good job of portraying is the fictional character who gets executed at the end. I forget the German major.
Kruger.
He had actually been given command of the bridge at 1:30 in the morning on March 7th. And he doesn't get to the bridge till 11 or 10 o'clock. And he loses his life over this because I think that's indicative of crossing that barrier was the last thing Hitler wanted to see happen. And I think it had a huge impact on the war. I mean, like you said, within 2 months, it was over.
Well, I think it was going to be over within 2 to 3 months anyway. But it's just certainly, like you said, I think it had more of a morale issue than it maybe necessarily did a military issue. Even though, not to say that you're wrong, because you're 100% right. We got 5, 6, 7 divisions over there in 24, 48 hours. Something. It was amazing how many people they got. And then 6, 7 days later, Patton crosses the Rhine. Of course, there's a famous picture of him taking a whiz in the Rhine. And then Monty up north. And I mean, it was going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not like, and that's something they make out in the movies. Like, if we stop them here, they can't get across. Baloney. We're coming. And there's nothing you can do to stop us. You can just make it more costly. But we're coming. And I think you're right in that, I can't remember who said it, but there was a German general who said that after the bridge at Remagen fell and the Rhine was wide open, that the inner door to Germany was open. And that's 100% true, because after that, there was really no other physical barrier that was going to, and by barrier, I'm talking rivers, mountains, whatever it may be, that was going to stop us from getting through. The Siegfried Line had already been broken numerous times. Hell is for Heroes, 2 weeks ago, listen to that one. And then, and then the river, the Rhine is done. The Alps are down there, but we're not going up into the Alps. We're going around them, going through the valleys or whatnot. But there was nothing really going to stop us at that point. And I think it kind of broke more of the spirit than it did anything, although there was still plenty of fanatical fighting when people fought.
Yeah, I think, Americans saw this as the home stretch after this point. We're round in third. And I think, something like you were saying, Seth, they don't really show this in the film, but I mean, engineers have been doing wet gap crossings and other feats like this the whole war. So we would have found a way, and we did find a way across the Rhine. It did help to have a few divisions across on the other side covering, but I think we forget, and the film sort of forgets, there are engineers that know how to do this, and it's coming.
That's something that I'm going to talk about in our mini episode that we're going to record soon. We're going to talk about the 291st Combat Engineers who built the longest treadway bridge across the Rhine River right next to the Ludendorff Bridge. Because, even as we had captured Remagen and we got to the other side and we established a bridge over there, they immediately moved Pergrin's people up there, the 291st, to start building that bridge, because they knew, even if that thing holds, which they knew eventually it was going to go, although they did send engineers out there to try and strengthen it, and they had every intention of trying to save that bridge, because why not? And they knew that they needed more to get. You can't just have one bridge. You got to have more. And I think the 291st, and I could be wrong, I'll tell you next week, will be, I think they built 6 in that area. That's a lot of bridge. And that's 6 heavy vehicle bridges to get people and equipment across that river. And they were under fire almost all the time.
And that's and I've actually been able to go to Remagen and see what's left of the bridgehead. It's a really intense river. It's one of these you look at and you go, yeah, I'm not getting into that. Kind of like we're used to seeing the Mississippi here, fast and violent. And that's where you can kind of get that those guys look down at it as they're crossing going, I don't want to go into that. Even though the river in the film looks much calmer and less intimidating, but it's pretty intimidating stretch of water.
Yeah. Do you think that the Bridge at Remagen, and we talked about this again, but let's actually get into it here. Do you think that the Bridge at Remagen, the movie, is an anti-war or a pro-war film? And was it a successful propaganda tool? Anybody?
Well, it was definitely anti-war. Without a doubt, that was an anti-war film. This is just after, in fact, while it was filming, I believe the Tet Offensive was going on when it came out. We were past that. Nixon, I think, I don't think he was in office yet, or maybe he had just taken office. But in any case, anti-war sentiment in the country was at its height. So
for sure.
So in the film, there's two instances of insinuating possible fragging. One after Angel kills the kid, he turns around, points the MP40 at Lieutenant Hartman, and then at the base of the bridge, when they're told that they have to go across, the major points the rifle at Hartman, and then Angel ends up punching him in the face. I mean, they did not like him, so they could have easily fragged him, which was big in Nam.
It was big and numb, but I don't want to say it was out of the realm of possibility to happen in the Second World War.
Oh, absolutely not. But to see it on film.
But yeah, it was a thing that was in the public knowledge in 1969 for sure. To be 100% sure. Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you. I think this movie is very, very anti-war. This is not The Dirty Dozen. This is not any of the movies that we've done, Kelly's Heroes, which to a point is anti-war too, but this is very, very anti-war, with the whole attitude. Everybody's just absolutely exhausted. The Germans are tired. Everybody's tired. Everybody's just exhausted. Everybody gets, for the most part, you see everybody get disgusted when they have to kill, which I kind of debate that, towards the end of the war. It is common knowledge that the war got more violent in the closing months than it did in the earlier part of the war. American soldiers had absolutely no problem killing Germans in March of 1945. Quite the opposite, actually. It became a sport, if you will. And, so that attitude, I'm like, that's not accurate for the time, but it's accurate for when the movie was made. So, it is definitely a very, very anti-war film. It's certainly not pro-war at all, unless you'd like to see tanks hauling ass down the road. But
I think there's a little bit of a sort of a pro-war vibe to it when they're crossing the bridge. I mean, you see these Americans with nothing but carbines taking out Germans from across the bridge and making this valiant stand. And again, it still drives me crazy. You have Germans lined up with 6 or 8 MG-42s that can't hit anything, like stormtroopers. They're just shooting at everything, and nobody's hardly going down. Most people seem to be dying in the film by explosion more than they are by rifle bullet or machine gun fire. But and I think it's interesting in this film too, compared to other films and other films that have been reviewed by this podcast. There's little to no character development, too. It seems like this is a common, like you said, an anti-war film. It's more about a theme, if you will, and less about the people who are in the movie. You don't see a lot of their background. You don't know a whole lot about them, how long they have or haven't been in the line. Half of them, you can't even remember their names because they're kind of here and they're gone. But I do think it's interesting for war films. They don't spend a lot of time on the character development or anything.
No, go ahead, Kaylee.
No, I think that kind of plays into what we were talking about earlier with them not portraying the actual characters. And like what Logan said is it kind of gets to an agenda for the film that it's easier to be anti-war when you're not portraying true people that the American public would view as heroes for what they had done. And Timmerman was actually deceased by this time. And so people may have known who he was and kind of revered him. So you wouldn't want to put him in an anti-war film if he's considered a hero.
Yeah, all these guys got Distinguished Service Crosses for taking the bridge. You don't want to trash them.
No, and they don't deserve to be.
No, absolutely not.
They don't deserve to be at all. But that's to your point, Logan. Is what you were saying. This is an anti-war film, and it's a product of its times. It's a product of 1968, 69, and for sure. I mean, we did Patton on this podcast way back when, and Patton was made in 1969, and I think it came out in 1970. I don't remember anymore, but it is not an anti-war film. And I remember we debated that on this show. That that was kind of a risk for Hollywood to take in 1969, 1970, and it very much was. And this is the back alley opposite of that whole thing. And it is what it is. It's a product of its times, and to a point, some of the attitudes and the way that they portray the American infantry is, I think, accurate for World War II, but it's also accurate for Nam. So.
What I also thought along that point, the way they portrayed soldiers, how they portrayed the Germans, they were a little more sympathetic, especially the civilians. I mean, this is one of the first times, I think, in a film that you see civilians getting bombed by Americans. You see the actual toll that's taking on the Germans.
On the bridge.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting. You kind of see a little more sympathetic. The mother grabbing the kid when Remagen's getting shelled.
The little girl that drops her doll, and then you see the doll floating down the river.
Mm-hmm. It was very symbolic. Very symbolic. So how well did the film portray the timeline of events, the actual timeline of events, and was it easy to follow? Kaylee, you're shaking your head.
It was awful. I mean, while I was watching it, I was thinking, I think the movie would have done well to have some sort of time reference given in the film. Because Timmerman and those guys, they get the assignment at like 6:30 in the morning on the 6th. And that's how quickly all this happens. And I think that it does drag it out. I mean, they take the bridge by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I think it's nighttime in the film by the time it happens. Also, like I mentioned, Major Scheller was the actual major who's put in command of the bridge the morning of the 7th. But in the film, his character is there for days, going back and forth, building up forces. They're able to get 88s in. They had none of that. I mean, it was a very compressed timeline, happening very quickly, and yeah, I think it does make the film a little hard to follow. I find myself going, okay, when was this happening?
What about you guys?
I agree. I with Kaylee, I think the timeline wasn't that great. It would be nice to see literally time or a timeline in the film. And what was it, like a week, 10 days that the bridge stayed there and everything
days.
too? It kind of, it seems like they, again, could have spent a little bit more time on, here's all this buildup and why it's important to take this bridge or whatever, but it would be neat to show a little bit of a victory on the other side of it and what was able to be done with it once it's taken. But yeah, I don't think the timeline's very accurate.
I had to watch it a couple times to figure out the timeline. I watched it at least twice, and then I did a whole bunch of reading on it to check that timeline, and then I watched it a couple more times, and absolutely not even close. They're showing it as being a few days when it's actually, like
hours.
Kaylee said, just hours.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, it's not, and we said that before, and that it's not 100% accurate in the representation of the way the bridge was taken. But you got to make a movie out of it. I'm not saying that it's right. I'm just saying I understand why they did it, and they're trying to dramatize something that took literally hours as opposed to 2 days, 3, whatever. I don't even know how many days it is in the film. And is it easy to follow if you're trying to follow the actual history of the event? No, not at all, because it doesn't follow the history of the event. Try it again, Seth. The history of the event, and it just doesn't follow it at all. But whereas it's just I don't know. It drags something out that should have been pretty quick. And I think if they would have followed Timmerman or his unit, which they did to a point, but if they would have actually followed the actual movements of that unit, this movie would have been really, really good.
Oh yeah,
because he was no joke. He was the real deal for sure.
When they get across and when they're fighting in the hill there, it ended up being called Flak Hill because they took so much flak and firepower there. And that, I agree with Tommy, that would have been really interesting to see because, okay, you got the bridge, great, now you have to hold it. And that's, to me, the more dynamic story is holding on to it.
They didn't even really show that. In fact, they're laying there in that hole for the entire night when really they're trying to dodge, I guess, the tunnel garrison, but really they captured that tunnel garrison within, I don't know, half an hour of capturing the actual bridge. I mean, they just came out. It
was quick.
They could have shown the actual counterattack, which would have been, like what y'all said earlier, incredibly interesting.
Yeah. And, an interesting tidbit of information on this is that, just because we had the bridge, the Germans knew, obviously, that we had it, and they were trying their best after we captured it to knock it out. And they sent, this is one of the last times you see any kind of large-scale Luftwaffe offensive action in the war, because they attacked the bridge with Stukas, of which there were still quite a few. And I don't know if it's the only, but it's certainly one of the only appearances of the Arado 234 Blitz, which was the German jet bomber that made several appearances over the bridge and scared the living hell out of the GIs because they didn't know what that thing was. It's an airplane with no propeller, and this thing is moving, coming over the bridge. Yet they failed to destroy it, even with their best efforts. And that was a really cool story in and of itself. So let's get to it. Logan, I'll start with you. Did you like this movie, and would you recommend it?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I enjoyed the movie. It was gritty. There's some dark humor in there. I enjoyed it. So yeah, I'd watch it again.
Tommy?
I'll admit it's not one of my favorite films. It's not one that I feel like, every year I've got to watch this or something. Honestly, it's probably been 15 or 20 years since the last time I watched this. And I think if it came on, Turner Classic Movies or something, and I was just sitting there watching TV with nothing to do, I might watch it, but it's not something I would just seek out all the time. But yeah, I would recommend it. There's some pretty cool battle sequences in there. There's some cool warfare with tanks, even though they have annoying sound effects when they fire. I would recommend it, yes. If you've never seen it, it's worth seeing. Is it something to watch, once or twice a year? No, I don't think so.
I agree with Tommy. It's been a while since I watched it, and the first time I put it on, I have to confess I fell asleep. It was late. But yeah, I mean, I think it has a place because it is, in spite of how important Remagen was arguably to the war, it's not something I think that gets as much attention. So I think it's valuable for that. Even if it's not accurate, hopefully it'll inspire you all to go out and read a little bit more about it. But yeah, I'd recommend it.
I agree. It has points of accuracy in it, and it has, obviously, we've discussed that at length here. It has points of inaccuracy in it as well. Like you, Tommy, I hadn't seen it in a very, very, very long time. I remember when I was a kid going to the Blockbuster Video, which is not far from my house, and that's what I did on the weekends, when I was 10 and 11 years old. Dork alert here. I'd go and I'd try and find a war movie that I hadn't seen that my mother would let me see. And and this was one of them. And I remember seeing this because, oh, cool. I didn't know anything about this. And I watched it. And, as a young kid, I thought, yeah, it's not too bad. And as I got older, I was like, yeah, it's not too bad. It's not too good, but it's not too bad. It kind of falls in the middle of the heap there. Yeah, I like it. It's not my favorite movie at all. I think I'm echoing what everybody around the table said here. It's not, I wouldn't even put it in my top 20. But it's entertaining. And it's inaccurate, but it also has some accuracy to it. It's interesting. It's a product of its times. And because of that, I would recommend check it out. Take that into mind when you look at it. Remember that it was made in 68 and 69, and keep that in mind. And I think you'll see some of the things that we pointed out here on this particular episode. So with that being said, Kaylee, can you sum it up? Any final thoughts?
I think it's a typical 60s war film to be enjoyed more as kind of a general war flick than as anything with historical value.
Tommy?
Tanks are sexy. Tanks are cool. It's worth seeing at least once. And thanks for having me on the podcast.
Da-doonch. Logan?
Gritty Vietnam-era anti-war film, but fun to watch.
Yep. I'm going to pull a quote, not from the movie because I didn't really find any that I liked in there, but we talked about him ad nauseum here, and I'm going to talk about him again next week, and it's Carl Timmerman. And he wrote a letter to his wife, and he says, and I quote, "There is no glory in war. Maybe those who have never been in battle find a certain glory and glamour that doesn't exist." And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, tune into our mini episode next week. And just so, if y'all would, we would greatly appreciate a review on iTunes, not just a rating. Let us know what you think, where we can improve and what we're doing well or not so well, especially Tommy, and it would be much appreciated. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. Please. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Mallory Kirk, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.